typically a Looks like I lost our recording there. No problem. I say these are typically not aggressive wounds. What's going to happen is you're going to be step on the stingray's back, tail's going to come up, and it's going to stab you in response in a defensive position. Now, the thing about stingray tails, though, is they are coated with an integument that has proteins that are heat labile and cause significant pain and hematologic abnormalities. And so these things bleed like crazy and they hurt really bad. The good news about them, though, is they're very treatable. And the key for treatment is heat, because these are heat labile proteins that are on the integument tails. And so putting someone in a hot tub, warm bucket of water for about 60 to 90 minutes is going to break that all down. It's actually just going to solve your problem. And then it's just a little local wound care to solve that. So any kind of stabbing injury, the key treatment is to heat it up. Contrast that with my stinging injuries. So this is a beach full of jellyfish here. And this is an example of a rash common from a jellyfish wound. And so what jellyfish have, unlike my stingrays, my stabbing creatures, is they have nematocysts. And they're all scattered along their tentacles, tens of thousands of them on an individual jellyfish. And those nematocysts are activated by pressure, so touching it. They're activated by temperature changes. They're activated by salinity changes, pH changes. And when that happens, they have these little coiled barbs that fire out and attack whatever prey has gotten in time to them, which can be this person's arm, for example. In the case of jellyfish, in addition to removing the tentacles by like physical means, so usually plucking them off is my way to go, we want to neutralize it. And the best way to neutralize is actually to use vinegar or acetic acid. And so you can just do a gentle spray or a gentle wash of the area, and that will help prevent any more nematocysts from firing and prevent any existing residue that may be left on the skin. Initially, it used to be, and up until the last couple of years, these two things were the only treatments. So heat it for stabbing, neutralize it for stinging. But new research, especially from our colleagues in Hawaii, has come out that says actually heat works pretty well for these two. And so the current algorithm for marine invasion animations in a coastal environment is if it stabs you, heat it up. If it stings you, neutralize it, and then also heat it up. And that applies to pretty much any species that does one of those two mechanisms. Now, there's a few that have antivenoms, and I will caveat this, my Australian colleagues do have a little more complicated spectrum of critters that they have to deal with. But for North America, for sure, this algorithm works really, really well. And then going to little tiny bugs, let's talk about some skin wounds. So let's talk about that guy who was sailing to Hawaii and duct taped his wound and called it a day. Now, most wounds in the marine environment that get infected are getting infected with the same bugs that we see on the terrestrial environment. So think about things that live on our skin: staph, strep, MRSA, right? And so our antibiotics will cover on land as they will cover on the water. But there's one bug that will infect marine wounds that we don't usually think about, and that's Vibrio. And these pictures are some examples of some wounds caused by Vibrio infections. You'll often see bullae, and they can be hemorrhagic bullae. And they'll usually develop a couple of days after the infection kind of gets started. Now, that being said, do I have to antibiotic prophylax every single person who gets every little cut they have on the beach? And the answer is no, right? The infection rates are still fairly low. We're talking single digits for most marine wounds. And so good wound care, good cleaning is pretty much the mainstay of treatment. Now, if it's a large wound, a deep wound, or I've got a patient who I would consider unhealthy at baseline, I'm thinking liver disease or diabetes or vascular disease, I may think about prophylactic antibiotics, but most times we're waiting until an infection actually develops. And these are my antibiotics to go to for any kind of Vibrio infection: Cipro, Bactrim, doxycycline. And so in addition, we also want to have staph and strep coverage. So you may have to do double coverage, but that's going to get me my Vibrio. Folks who have liver disease and cirrhotics are particularly at risk for Vibrio infections. And they actually can turn into fulminant infections and end up in septic shock very, very quickly from them. It's just an inability to process the bacteria and how it attacks. And so those are the folks that I'm prophylaxing, and those are the folks that I'm going to break out the big guns. I'm going to break out the big IV antibiotics for them because they can get really sick really fast. And then uniquely in those liver patients, they actually don't necessarily need to have a wound infection to get exposed to Vibrio. You can even get it from eating shellfish. And so I usually tell my liver patients, stay away from the oysters. Right now, we're in a norovirus outbreak in Southern California from oysters, so avoid it for that, but also avoid it for your Vibrio. All right. I'm going to touch very briefly on diving injuries. Dr. Covington and Dr. Lambert both have done excellent lectures on diving injuries and gone into the deep dives, and those are all available on the GOWME YouTube channel. So if you're interested in dive medicine, I would highly recommend checking them out. But dive injuries and under the sea injuries are something we have to think about in the marine environment, depending on what activities you're participating in. And dive injuries can happen at any phase of a dive. You can happen on descent, like this guy who's got a mask squeeze and a hyper overpressurization injury, or they can happen at coming on ascent. And so this is an example of cutis marmorata, which is a decompression sickness. And or skin bend is the other name for it. And so there's some really neat, unique pathologies associated with dive medicine also in the marine environment. And so if you're interested in that, I would really encourage you to check out those really cool lectures. All right. And then finally, I'm going to kind of get to the thing that is the most common and the most widely seen in the marine environment, which is trauma. So we're going to watch a little video explaining why booms are called boom, and you'll see someone who experienced trauma and had a really bad day. It's going along for a little coastal sail, makes a nice tack, doesn't pay attention, and oof, whacks him in the head. A good day turned bad really quickly. And so folks around him are asking him if he's okay, and he's not feeling too good. And we got to see it in slow mo, of course. And so that is why the boom is called a boom. Well, it just wants to keep showing it here. It's all good. All right, so sailing injuries. So we're going to talk a little bit about sailing injuries in specific because there's been a couple studies that have done and looked at basically what happens and how many injuries are there. But these numbers and these injuries definitely apply into all sorts of boating. So whether you're a power boater, whether you're a sailor, um, whether you're hanging out on cruise ships, you can definitely suffer any of these injuries. Fortunately, sailing is a very safe sport. And deaths and injuries in sailing are not super duper common. Uh, for those for deaths in sailing, usually it's involved in falling overboard or capsizing. So capsizing, for those who are not sailors, is having your boat turn over. The vast majority of that, 82% of deaths of sailors were not wearing their PFD. So I can't stress enough PFDs, PFDs, PFDs. And luckily, oh my God, all my guys here are wearing inflatable PFDs, so good on them. And then a not insignificant number involving alcohol. And I think probably this, I would have to say, I don't have any evidence to support this, but the sailing numbers involving alcohol may be a little lower than the boating numbers involving alcohol. Um, because 12 seems a little lower in my brain than probably should be. But other than dying in sailing, most of the injuries we have are contusions, they're lacerations. Hands, arms, legs, heads to a lesser extent. You trip and fall over something, you're hit by something, you're caught in rigging or caught in lines. And this guy is working a winch right here. This is a very common source of injuries. Hands and fingers getting caught in a winch is a very common way to get hurt. And so a sailboat is full of hard objects that are constantly moving, as are you. And so very easy to encounter things you're not expecting to. And so there's a study done by Nathanson et al. He's out of Rhode Island, taking a look at what parts of the boat tend to hurt people. And so fortunately, the sail and the mast, and these things are fairly rare, but the most common things is impacts with the boom, about 12%, impacts with sheets or lines, so getting caught up in ropes, and then impacts with the is the most common at 18%. And so usually it's something you're going to hit or something that's going to wrap around you. Now, I must say, when I'm sailing, my personal nemesis is right here. And this is called the companionway stairs. And so, just to give you a little bit of orientation, this is a stairwell that goes from the deck down to the lower level of the boat. And some crazy people build companionway stairs that look like this. And so, as you can imagine, falling down companionway stairs is a very common occurrence. And I can definitely account for a couple lower leg injuries myself between that. But basically, it's trips, slips, falls. That's going to be the main injuries we're talking about in sailing, other than the unique marine environments that we've talked about already. All right, so we're going on a trip, and we're going to go for a sail. We're going to go sail down to Catalina, out to Catalina. It's a day and a half sail. We're taking our friend's boat, which is a real nice boat here, and we're gonna think about, okay, well, what are we gonna do if something goes wrong, right? We're the doctor, we're the medical professional, and they're all gonna look to us. And what are we gonna be relying on? Now, depending on the vessel you're on, you may have a lot of different options for what you have. If you're on a cruise ship, you may have what looks like a full-on ER trauma bay, right? Imaging capabilities with ultrasound and X-ray, labs, a full pharmacy stock, all the supplies you could possibly need. If I got this, I could do a heck of a lot, right? Now I'm on my friend's day sale, and he's got a med kit that he bought online that has some bandages, has some Tylenol and Motrin, has even brought oxygen because he's a diver, which is great. But it's going to be mostly first aid that we can accomplish if something goes wrong. Let's say we're having a really bad day, the boat breaks down, and we have to get in a life raft. Now we just got what's in our pockets. And so this is an Altoid medical and survival kit that someone built, which I think is pretty cool. It has all sorts of little devices, including things to start fire, to navigate with, a knife, some wound care supplies. And so I would advocate always, and this is something I carry with me, is a little first aid and survival kit anytime going on an adventure. Uh, Independent of how dangerous it seems like it's going to be, it's good to have some stuff with you. So it could be anything from my full-on ER trauma bay to what I have in my pocket as far as what my equipment is. Well, you might say, why don't I just call the Coast Guard if something bad happens? The Coast Guard is an amazing resource. They provide search and rescue, among other services, as part of their mission out to 200 miles from the coastal United States. All right. Coast Guard swimmers, incredibly talented folks. They can do rescues off cruise ships. They do them not infrequently. They do medical evacs off the cruise ships hanging out around San Diego, and they can pluck folks off having all variety of medical concerns. But the medical capacity of the Coast Guard helicopters is extremely limited. These are small aircraft. There's not a lot of space, and a lot of our Coast Guard swimmers do not have advanced medical training. And so, really, they are a transport organization, a rescue organization, not really a medical provider. And so, Coast Guard is awesome, but know that there are some limitations to what they provide. Let's say I'm more than 200 miles off coast. Let's say I'm sailing to Hawaii. What rescue options do I have? So this device down here in the bottom is called an EPIRB. EPIRB satellite phones. EPIRB is basically a personal locator beacon that's operated by satellite. You can see a little bit how it operates here. This is how folks are going to know where you are and know that you're in distress. And so 30, 40 years ago, doing this talk, your options, once you were outside of the radius of radio contact, were pretty limited. But now with technology, we have definitely made the world smaller, and we've definitely made the oceans smaller, to the point where your rescue options are much more expansive, even in remote settings. But it's not the Coast Guard that's going to come rescue if you're more than 200 miles offshore. Their capabilities do have a limit of distance. It's most likely actually going to be one of these cargo ships, right? It's going to be a vessel of opportunity that's going to come by in response to your distress beacon. And so even once you get rescued, your medical capabilities may be very limited until you can get back to shore, or back to higher levels. And in some cases, even recently with all of our technology, there's no help coming. And so you're going to be on your own. And so we're going to finish up talking a little bit about survival at sea. Here are examples of a handful of gentlemen, and interestingly, they're all men here, who were lost at sea and had incredible stories of survival over long periods of time. Poon Lim is up here on the left. We saw him earlier. He was a Chinese sailor in World War II, whose boat was sunk, and he spent 133 days on a raft before he was rescued with very minimal supplies off the raft he built. Steve Callahan, you may have heard of in the early 90s. He was stranded on a lifeboat for 76 days. There's been a movie and a book about his adventures and his experience. One of the craziest ones is actually from 2016. This is pretty wild. This is Brett Archibald. He's a South African. He was actually on a surf trip in the Indian Ocean, had some bad pizza, and was puking his guts out overboard at night when he fell overboard off the surf boat as it was going from destination to destination. They didn't realize he was gone for several hours on the boat. And so he actually spent 28 hours treading water without any devices at all in the Indian Ocean before they rescued him, which is pretty wild. And then the winner of the survival, or let's say the loser of the survival Olympics, is over here on the right, Mr. Jose Salvador Alvarenga. This was again in a fairly recently. He's a Mexican fisherman. He was fishing off the west coast of Mexico with a partner who was their first day fishing together. They got caught in a storm and the boat got disabled at sea. And he survived. His partner didn't survive, but survived for 439 days in his fishing boat. And pretty much, if we think fishing boat, we think about the vessel we saw earlier going through the heavy seas. This is pretty much just a dinghy. And he had a chest of fish that he used for shelter and for sustenance along the ways. So after 439 days, he started on the west coast of Mexico. He actually ran ashore in the Marshall Islands in the Western Pacific. And when he came ashore, obviously he speaks only Spanish, and there's not a lot of Spanish speakers in the Marshall Islands. And so communication difficulties of explaining, hey, what happened was pretty wild. And so he holds the modern record for longest survival at sea. There is a story from the 1800s about a Japanese sailing vessel that was cut adrift for 480 days, but we've got documentation on this one to go for Jose Salvador Alvarenga. And so these are guys that, all of our modern technology as far as communications and rescue, we were out of luck, and they had to rely on their own wits and their own survival skills. So some of you may be familiar with this. This is called the rules of three for survival, right? This applies both in terrestrial and a maritime environment. And we think about what we need at our basic level. So 3 minutes without air. So you hopefully on the surface, you are actually going to be okay on that front, right? Now, if you're a diver, we got a bigger issue there. So 3 minutes without air may be the limiting factor for divers, but for our lost at sea gentlemen, it was not a problem. 3 hours without shelter. Now, that shelter could be a boat. That shelter could be your clothing. That shelter could be whatever you are able to fix to protect you from the sun, protect you from the environment, protect you from the weather. The usual limiting factor in most folks is the 3 days without water, right? You think, I'm on the ocean, I'm surrounded by water. But actually, seawater is, because of its salinity, it actually makes things worse and actually worsens dehydration. So you're surrounded by water, but you have none to drink. The one exception to be that being in a polar environment, you can drink some melted ice caps, but it's a pretty limited way to get water. So 3 days without water is usually our limiting factor. You can go a long time without food, right? 3 weeks without food. And then I added one to this, which is if you've ever seen Castaway with Wilson, the volleyball, 3 months without companionship. And so there's actually been some studies done. This dates back from 1956, so it's older data. But taking a look and saying, how much is the minimum of that 3 days without water that you could survive with? And what this looked at was 121 life craft voyages going back mostly during World War II, and who survived and who didn't. And so basically here, what we're looking at here is the daily water ration per man, the number of men at risk, the number of men who died, and a percentage of that. And what you see is you could have none, you have some, you have 0 to 4 ounces, 4 to 8, 8 to 12, and all the water you want. And if you look at the percentages, there's a real change once you get up to that 4 ounces of water, where you drop from about 25% survival, 25% death rate to only about 7%. So 4 to 8 ounces of water, 8 ounces is a cup. So we're talking about a half a cup to a cup of water daily. Now, in our normal function, we typically consume about 3 liters of water at minimum. So you can survive very minimal rations here on a half to 1 cup of water daily, which is pretty wild. So not a study we're going to replicate anytime soon, only retrospective data on this one. We're not planning on dehydrating folks to death, but just know that you need some water, but not a lot. All right. So that kind of brings us to the full picture of our medicine at sea. There's a lot of things to consider, right? Talking about a very large, a very austere environment can vary in how it looks depending on how far away from shore you are, what kind of resources you have. We have a couple of unique medical problems, including environmental issues, drowning, hazardous marine life, dive injuries, and sailing trauma. And then your rescue capabilities may be very distinct depending on what you're doing and who you're with. And then the last piece is have some survival at sea techniques and have some survival gear available if you're hanging out in a marine environment. So that brings a close to my section of this chat. I would love to hear any questions that you guys have. Hopefully I can answer. And let me know what you think.
Thank you so much for presenting. That was really great. Definitely learned a lot that's like directly applicable to, daily life. Oh, we have our first question too. From Charlie. We have for the gentleman who survived 400 days at sea, how about nutrition concerns such as scurvy?
Yeah, so it's interesting. You see photos of him right after he was rescued, and that photo of him with a heavy beard was just after his rescue. And he's wasted, essential wasting, obviously malnourished. He did have fish to eat, and he was actually able to catch fish while he was drifting. And so he actually had a pretty decent protein supply, but definitely vitamins were lacking in his all fish diet. And then you see photos of him like a year later, and you can't even recognize the guy. He's a totally different person once he built up his stores again.
Thank you. Usually questions come in, but it takes like a second for people to start
It's all good.
developing them.
Well, I say I have a question for the audience, which is in my marine envenomations piece. Has anyone here ever had their own personal experience with marine envenomations? Anyone got a stingray injury or had a jellyfish injury?
Hey, Dr. Altschuh. I have not personally, but that just got me thinking. This is definitely something that I knew at one point, but do you know off the top of your head the maybe the physiology behind um I'm blanking on his name, but the amazing Australian um guy who was stung by a stingray a couple of years ago?
Steve Irwin?
Steve Irwin. I feel terrible. I forgot his name.
That's
But
okay.
yeah, could
No,
you
that's
describe
okay.
what happened?
Yeah, so they grow their stingrays a heck of a lot bigger out there than we do here. No, so most of my Southern California stingrays are about the size of a dinner plate, and so their tails are only about yay long. So you get stabbed with that, it's gonna hurt. It can cause a good sized wound, but it's not usually gonna go that deep. In Australia, they have stingrays that are about the size of a dining room table. And so the stingray that got him actually, it was just fluke accident, actually stabbed him in the chest, and he had direct cardiac trauma. And so basically had a cardiac tamponade from that. So fortunately, a very rare occurrence, the one that gets a lot of publicity. The most common places to get hit with a stingray are actually in your foot and your ankle. And so it's usually stepping on and having the tail whip up. I guess if you try and give a stingray a hug, maybe you could get it in the chest, but it's not the easiest way to go. So I see a question here about wilderness fellowships for internal medicine trained physicians. Awesome. Yeah. So I am a ER doc, and most of the fellowships are designed for ER physicians. The reason for that is it's easier for the hospitals to basically support us with funding, right? So anyone who does shift work, you can justify your funding to do a fellowship. There are several fellowships that are open to both family medicine, internal medicine trained physicians as well. And they are basically have to find some way to fund your fellowship. And so whether you're doing urgent care, whether you're doing hospitalist shifts, there are a number of programs that are available for that. I know thinking Nevada has had some flexibility with that. Virginia Tech is another one. But a lot of them, if you can basically come to the program and say, hey, here's how I can justify making this work, they're pretty amenable to that. And let's see if any other questions there. In New Jersey, jellyfish also definitely irritating. Yeah, I grew up in New England, and so I had a lot of poking at jellyfishes with sticks when I was a kid, and I got to experience lots of jellyfish stings that were very uncomfortable, but not dangerous necessarily. Couple jellyfish things, right? So don't pee on a jellyfish sting. Not going to help you. Makes your friends think they're cool when you're a teenager, but not going to fix it. Other things that don't work is baking soda, right? That's a common myth. Um, and then trying to put jellyfish stings in hot water. So hot, fresh water will actually cause more discharge. So you want to neutralize it first with the vinegar before you heat it up. And so going right to the hot water will actually just make things worse to start with.
I guess we can allow like 1 more minute just in case anyone's thinking. Um,
Good.
and then we'll wrap up. I guess I'm kind of wondering, do you know like the lore behind why people think peeing on jellyfish stings is the right thing to do? Is it a TV thing?
There's some thought that maybe like there's some acid-base changes from your urine, but urine is pretty much neutral, so it's a little warm maybe. I think mostly it's just teenage boys looking for something silly that they could do, where a lot of traditions come up with. So yeah, no evidence behind that one.
We have a couple more questions. First one is, what's the physiology behind heat helping to heal some of these wounds?
Yeah, so the way think about heat is actually the proteins that are on the integument of the stingray barb, and in the jellyfish sting, it's a combination of a bunch of different chemicals that could cause the trauma and cause the injury. The cool thing about them is those are all heat labile proteins. And so when you heat them up, you're actually degrading and breaking down those proteins. And so they don't have that same toxic effect once they get hot. Now, interestingly, for stingrays, for example, if you put someone in hot water and you leave them for, say, 10, 15 minutes, and then you pull them out of the hot water, they'll feel great when they're in the water. But as soon as you pull them out, if that protein hasn't been totally degraded, the pain will come right back. And so that's actually how we do it clinically to know have they been treated long enough. Is you take them out for 15 minutes, if they still feel good, you can go home. And on the beaches around here, the lifeguards in the summer will set up literally bucket lines of hot water. So at La Jolla Shores, they'll have on like 4th of July weekend, 30 people sitting on a wall with their foot in a bucket for all the stingray injuries we see here. And that's their key. That's their thing. They got an assembly line going for them. But the heat is really what works amazingly well for them. And so the mantra for that is if it stabs you, heat it up. If it stings you, neutralize it and then heat it up.
And looks like one last question is, Adriana was asking if you would share your email to contact with if any further questions arise.
I would be happy to. I will put my email in the chat. I would be happy to talk to anyone here. And if you have any questions about wilderness medicine, marine medicine, fellowships, how to make this thing work with your real job, your day job, and your fun job, let me know. Anytime, happy to talk with folks.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much. I also dropped in the chat our YouTube as well as website. So if anyone wants to check out those talks Dr. Altschuh referenced about dive medicine or undersea medicine, you can click on those links to learn more. Thank you so much, Dr. Altschuh, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in today. And we'll see you in about 2 weeks to learn about some space medicine.
That sounds awesome. I'll think I'll have to tag along for that one as well. Have a great night, guys.
Thank you.